Well, siêu được God. Ai cái sau này sao hôn để cái dạng what I can scale to like cái nào đó. Rồi hi dưới chơi cái này thì chơi sẽ chỉ sẽ đâu có sẽ hi đi. Still God story. I'll say that we will do to God story. My name is Wade or Ryan. I work for the Cherokee Nation right now. I serve in the capacity of a history and cultural specialist. And our original speaker that was going to speak with this is a gentleman named Roy Hamilton, and he's a historic preservation officer. And he would love to be here today, but he had an opportunity to go to North Dakota. And so I get to come and visit with you guys. I'm going to go over there, in a couple of weeks. So we all get to take turns going. But I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. I work for the tribe. I've worked for the tribe for about 10 years. We're in northeastern Oklahoma, not too far from here, and I get to travel a lot. In my capacity as a history and cultural specialist, I primarily do cultural presentations to our at-large Cherokee communities. Our at-large Cherokee communities have become a very integral part of our cultural and social landscape in the Cherokee Nation because more than half of our citizens, our tribal members, live outside of our 14-county tribal jurisdictional area, which means that we have Cherokees all over the United States, and they're concentrated in urban areas, primarily, large cities. Quite a few of our Cherokees, more than 30,000, live in California, and so there are 7 different community groups in California. There are a couple up north from there in Washington State. There are some in Colorado, and New Mexico, and Arizona, Kansas. We even have some down in Florida, and of course Texas too. So we have about 22 different satellite communities that have nonprofit organizations incorporated under the Cherokee Nation, and we go out to those communities, we visit with them. We have picnics where our politicians will go and listen to the people, and then throughout the year they send us out to do presentations. So even though this isn't technically one of our satellite communities, you guys know the history of the area. Cherokees have been here well before we even went into Indian Territory, what we call Oklahoma now. Today I get to speak with you all about some of our current issues, not just Cherokee Nation, but happening in the state of Oklahoma with other various Indian tribes, as well as what's going on up in North Dakota. Roy asked me to speak about some of these ideas, and my perspective is very Cherokee-centric. I grew up in the Cherokee Nation. I lived there. It's what I live and breathe. My dad is not Cherokee, but my mom is, and what's interesting is even though they're not together, and they didn't always agree when they were, he's very supportive of my heritage and very supportive of the Cherokee Nation, even though he himself isn't a Cherokee citizen. He's mainly Scotch-Irish, and so I like to think that I get some of my more outgoing characteristics from that side of my family. Now, before I worked for our Community and Cultural Outreach Department as a history and cultural specialist that did presentations, I was over at our Cherokee Language Immersion School. We have a charter school, chartered with the state of Oklahoma, that teaches in the Cherokee language. They're basically very similar to a regular public school, but instead of teaching, reading, writing, and arithmetic in English, they do it in Cherokee. And the Cherokee school goes from 3-year-olds all the way up through the 6th grade. And hopefully when they leave the program, they're fluent enough in the language to where they can carry it on to junior high and high school. And hopefully one day when they start having kids, hopefully later more than sooner, because I've been with them a long time. I know those kids. Once they get married and have kids, hopefully they pass on the language to their children. One of the main issues that Native tribes right now are becoming mobilized around are environmental concerns. And I think that, sometimes when people think of environmental concerns, they think of kind of crazy environmentalists and kind of gives people a black eye. But at the same time, we have traditional teachings that go with this role with Native people. And I'll get into that story a little bit. I'll give you some of our contemporary issues and some of our traditional value systems that go into our contemporary issues. So not just how things look from a contemporary or modern perspective, but the roots of those things and why some of these things are valuable to us. Now, sometimes I get to go out to communities and talk about the language. I like to talk about our culture, our ceremonies, our traditions. I like to talk about our politics, but sometimes it's dangerous to talk about politics. Especially Cherokee politics. I mean, everybody knows how contentious national politics are. Just imagine being related to everybody that was in that fight. It's just twice as ugly. And people are just as passionate about it. You know, we're fortunate that right now we have an administration that's really into doing outreach and educating the public, and so we have an opportunity to go out and visit and speak with people. All across Oklahoma, we have 39 federally recognized tribes there. There are movements to reclaim our identity. If you go back in time to, you know, the original 13 colonies, there were a lot of treaties made, initially with England. And the crux of those treaties from a tribal perspective was to say that, yes, we have colonies on this land, but we respect your land. And we want to have a good relationship so we can trade. And the fur trade and all those resources along those eastern seaboard were really fueled by this political policy that the various tribes had with the English crown. Basically, England claimed the sole right to conduct trade with the tribes. And if you look at what was going on in England at the time, a lot of the population had swelled to such a large degree that the resources were very depleted. Things were overforested, waters were polluted. There was a lot of illness and a lot of sickness due to, you know, the rampant population changes and also the widening global economy. For that time, you know, the Silk Road, the discoveries that they made when they came to the New World, it opened up not just their trade networks, but also their social networks, and that caused an influx of communicable diseases. Primarily from the east towards Europe, there were lots of things introduced, and especially in the heavy concentrated areas of Asia, where influenza is still born and bred. When people wonder why people get colds and why people get flus, it's because all of those domesticated animals over there are kept in close quarters to sustain the population. And some of those diseases that are passed around amongst the farm animals mutate and get passed on to the people. And some of those communicable diseases came over to Europe, and there were lots of plagues and lots of illness. And when the boats came across the ocean and landed in North America, it was even more contagious. What we learned is that our population was reduced down to 1/10 of what it was. There were probably well over 1 million Indians in the United States at the time. Now, we use the term Indians in Oklahoma all the time. So if you don't like that, I apologize. I'll try to stick with Native Americans, but it's 2 words instead of 1. So it's a little bit more challenging to iterate. But when the Spanish found the natives down in Central America, they called them Indians. Now, a lot of people think it's because Columbus was looking for a trade route to India, and that's possible. But an alternative explanation is that some of the people that had a friendly eye towards the natives that they found saw that they were living hand to mouth, but in direct contact with the land and in a equilibrium with the land. I won't say harmony, but an equilibrium. And they said, similar to maybe how people might have lived in the Garden of Eden. From a romantic perspective, they wrote home back to Europe, and they wrote two different types of stories, either terrible savages that kill and eat people, or wonderful noble spirits that we should all be like. And when they focused on the latter, they said that these folks were in Dios, which is related to this concept of in God's way. So that was one interpretation. Now, it's not a very common interpretation, although I've heard it from different walks. I know the history of the situation, that there were two main religious leaders in the Catholic Church after European contact that were arguing about what it meant when they found people here that weren't from India. This was not a good trade route. They said there are these people here, but what do we do with them? And there was a church scholar named Sepulveda, and this church scholar believed that these Indians were not human, that they were more like a fancy chimpanzee. And because they weren't completely human, they could be enslaved or even killed at will. And there were quite a few of those early conquistadors that shared in his opinion, and things were very rough on the native people that met those first Spanish explorers. There was another thinker at the time named De las Casas, and he won out. His philosophy was that Indians were indeed humans and had souls, and therefore should be saved. Because of that, there were policy changes, and things started to change. And by the time the English began to colonize North America, the Dutch and the English and the French and the Spanish, they had already decided that Indians had souls. Now, it didn't mean that we had land rights in the same way, but that we had souls. And there was something that was espoused until recently, which is called the doctrine of discovery, which means that those who discovered the land have primary rights to it. And those that were already on the land only had aboriginal title. Aboriginal title is very nice, but it doesn't mean you get to keep it, because aboriginal title means that yes, you live on it, but you don't know how to use it. The way that land was legally taken was through this declaration. This declaration, and they said that the only way to extinguish aboriginal title was through just war or through trade. So, it was up to the leaders to determine what just war was. And initially, those 13 colonies, they had a lot of difficulties. You guys have all heard of the first Thanksgiving, and there were some good times too. But ultimately, what it came down to is that the colonies wanted to expand their land. They were backed by corporate interests in Europe, and they wanted to expand their land base, and the King of England stopped it. So when I was in elementary school and I took history, I heard about the Declaration of Independence. I heard about the Boston Tea Party, Paul Revere's ride. And since then I've learned that some of that is fancied up. and it's kind of used to instill a sense of, patriotism, and that's valuable. But at the same time, it covered up a very strong truth that one of the primary reasons for that revolution wasn't because of the price of tea. It was because they wanted to expand west. And the Crown of England had already made treaties with those tribes, saying that we would maintain the borders. That was one of the primary issues. And so when the colonists declared war with England, guess who sided with England? Almost all the tribes, because they saw it in their best interest to side with the people that said, we'll keep the borders. And westward expansion took place. It did. Manifest destiny happened, and within 150 years, those Conestoga wagons crossed the west, and they ended up in California. They took a long time to get there. Our elders, they say that we have these stories of where we came from. And the stories tell us that our ancestors had some forethought, that they saw the writing on the wall. And so our Cherokee ancestors began to patrol the borders. They began to determine what was appropriate or what was inappropriate, and they began to make decisions as communities. Now this was before the removal. This was, you know, very early on. Our first recorded trader, fur trader, was a guy named Cornelius Doherty, and he settled among Cherokees, took Cherokee wives, and other fur traders took suit. And from very early on, you know, the middle of the 1600s, we had people intermarrying with Scots, Irish people, English, Dutch, French, and they had Cherokee children. What I mean by that is, our ancestors used to live in a world where everybody was Native American. The majority of the population that we came into contact in the Southeast had very similar cultural traditions as us. We were the only Southern Iroquois speaking tribe. Now you guys have all heard of the Iroquois, right? They don't like to be called Iroquois. They call themselves Haudenosaunee, which means people of the Longhouse, but everybody else calls them Iroquois. So if you're Iroquois, please forgive me. It's easier to say. The Iroquois were our neighbors to the north, and linguistically, they had the most similar language to us. The most famous Iroquois are in the League of the Five Nations, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and they were originally 5 tribes that confederated under this thing they called the Law of Peace, and we weren't a part of that. They were all up north of us, on the far east, next to the ocean, were the Mohawks. The next ones in line, going from east to west, were the Oneida. The ones in the middle, they called themselves the Keepers of the Fire. They were the Onondaga. The next ones in line, going westward, are the Cayuga, and the final ones were the Senecas. And the Senecas were our hated enemies. The Cherokees fought them at every opportunity. They were laid out in this line, and they called it people of the Longhouse because they lived in big longhouses, but they also saw the arrangement of their territories as being places within a longhouse itself. So if they were to draw a map, a symbolic map of their territory, they would have probably drawn a longhouse. And in fact, they said that the Mohawk were the guardians of the eastern door, and the Senecas were the guardians of the western door, just as the Onondagas were the firekeepers in the center. The Mohawk are linguistically closest to us as Cherokees. Their language is the most like us out of everybody else in the universe. In fact, we even have a couple of words in common. One of them that I know is G-squo-wo, which means robin, but nothing else is intelligible. So when we hear a Mohawk person speak their language, it sounds like they're talking Cherokee, but doing it wrong. Sometimes it sounds like we recognize a word here or there. We definitely recognize sounds, but the meanings are just not the same. The linguists say that it's been at least 3,000 years since us and the Mohawk share the same language. And we're the only Southern Iroquois speaking tribe. There were a few other tribes that were from up north that moved to the south, like the Tuscarora, but we chased them back up north when we were fighting on the same team as the English. We were known as the warlords of the Southeast. We held the Smoky Mountains, and that was our homeland. Some of that land we took from other tribes and expanded our territory. At one time, we used to hold over 81 million acres in the Southeast. We held most of North Carolina and parts of South Carolina, a lot of Kentucky, a lot of Tennessee, West Virginia, Georgia, and Alabama. We were right in the middle there along those mountains. As time went by, we lost all that land. Well, there's a remnant. There's a group of Cherokees that still live back east called the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. They prefer to be called the Eastern Band Cherokee Nation. I think they're still working on officially changing their name. But there were less than 1,000 of them that stayed behind. Rough estimates, about 500. But from those original 500 that didn't go on the Trail of Tears, they're up to about 14,000 now. And they're one of the 3 federally recognized Cherokee tribes. The other one, where I work, is the Cherokee Nation. Now, when we incorporated under the state of Oklahoma, we incorporated as Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. Now, since then, they've amended the Constitution and everything, and they go back to the Cherokee Nation. And they claim inheritors of the historical Cherokee Nation. There's another group that also claims inheritance of the historical Cherokee Nation. They're called the United Keetoowah Band. Now, we call them UKB for short, but United Keetoowah Band is more accurate, and the most accurate is their full legal name, which is United Keetoowah Band of Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma. So UKB is always easier to say. Ultimately, UKBs and Cherokee Nation, at this point, we're all mixed up. At the time of Oklahoma statehood, there was an act put through Congress. After the Allotment Act that divided up our lands, there was another act that said that you have to accept the Allotment Act and we're going to dissolve your court system. And it was called the Curtis Act. And this Curtis Act had a timeline. If the tribes accepted allotment, this wouldn't happen. But if they didn't accept allotment, it would happen at this date, or something else would happen at this date. And it just got progressively worse until the tribes would be dismantled. So they had to, at some point, vote to accept allotment. Well, in the process of this breaking down of the tribe, the Curtis Act made our own legal system illegal. And so our judicial system that the Cherokee Nation had developed in Indian Territory was done away with. And so that meant that we couldn't have elections. If you don't have a court system, you can't have elections. So we couldn't elect our tribal council. We couldn't elect our legislature. We couldn't elect our chief. But we still continued to exist. And the President of the United States would pick a chief every so often, and that person would act legally as a responsible party on behalf of the Cherokee Nation. Well, when the Cherokee Nation came back in the 1970s, they claimed it was never completely dead, but it was broken. So they rewrote the Constitution and they modified it and came back as the Cherokee Nation in the 70s. But there was a group of Cherokees that never really were able to fit into American society. They were not successful in local Oklahoma politics, and they suffered. People that we call full-blood today. Now, full-blood is an interesting word. From a Cherokee cultural perspective, it's not the same as a fraction. Now, we have, all of us little fellow recognized Indians, we have these cards called CDIB, Certificate Degree of Indian Blood. We have a pedigree, and there's a fraction on that card. So if your grandma was nothing but Cherokee, her card would be 4/4. But your mama's card would be 2/4 or 1/2, 1/2. My card would be 1/4. My kid's card would be 1/8, which seems pretty logical until you marry somebody that's a 3/4 and you're a 1/8. And at some point, these fractions get really, really crazy. There were a group of full-bloods, and back then, before we had the cards and things, before Oklahoma statehood, full-blood meant somebody that looked Cherokee, that spoke Cherokee, that lived Cherokee. Because even though they cared about who their family was, if your great-great-great-great-grandpa was an English fur trader, you probably didn't even know it. And if everybody else in your family since then was Cherokee, then that's what you were. And they had almost a social designation that today we interpret as a biological distinction. But back then, being a full-blood was a social quality. And being a mixed blood was somebody that probably didn't look Cherokee, probably didn't speak Cherokee, probably didn't do a lot of Cherokee things. They might have been just as progressive as somebody living in New York, but because of their ancestry and heritage, they had a legal right to be a Cherokee citizen. And around the time of the Trail of Tears, maybe 15, maybe 10% of our population was that minority of people that we would call mixed blood today. Well, the full-bloods, for lack of a better term, were the people that had their tribal identity, their ceremonies, their culture, very much so their language. And they were the majority of the Cherokees. They were the ones that didn't want to come on the Trail of Tears. They were the ones that wanted to live in their homelands and be buried next to their great-grandparents when they passed away. They're much more conservative in nature and more focused on tradition, where the mixed bloods are usually the most progressive, what people might consider forward-thinking, or at least open to the civilization policies of the United States. And there was a dichotomy that really erupted during the Civil War. And the full-bloods took really swimmingly to Baptists. We had some missionaries before then, before the Civil War. Our first missionary efforts were not very successful, but right around the turn of the maybe 1802, I believe it was. I know our first convert was in 1808, but right around 1802 they asked the missionaries to come in. They were Moravian missionaries. Modern day, I mean, most people think of Lutherans, but Moravians used to be a bigger deal than the Lutherans back then. But I think it's all kind of similar, very close, where a lot of Methodists came from. But the Moravians were invited to Spring Place, Georgia, to set up a mission. But the Cherokees at the time said, bring your books, bring your teachers, bring your schools, but don't teach our kids religion. That's what they said. Well, they were missionaries. What are you going to do, right? I mean, that's their job, right, to carry the gospel. So there was an initial conflict, but their first convert was a little girl that was orphaned. And so the missionaries, of course, took in the orphans, and at some point, Christianity began to spread among Cherokees. And there were contests between churches to see who really got to missionize to the Cherokees. The federal government in the 1870s, this is later, but in the 1870s, the federal government actually divided up Indian tribes and reservations, and there was a lottery to the churches. So churches could basically bid on which reservation they could go and missionize to. But this was well before that. This was well before that. This is, we're thinking, around 1820 about this time. Before the Trail of Tears, before the removal, there were missionary efforts in the Cherokee Nation, and there were 3 very, very important court cases called the Marshall Trilogy. Now, John Marshall at the time was the Supreme Court Justice, head Supreme Court Justice, Chief John Marshall. He was also one of our presidents of the United States, too. But in this capacity, he was in charge of overseeing these Cherokee court cases, which we lost most of. But one of them in particular that we lost was when we were suing. It was actually Worcester versus Georgia. And there was a missionary named Worcester that had lived among the Cherokees and was very active and well loved by the people there. And the state of Georgia did not like the Cherokee Nation, because way, way before the Trail of Tears, they had been promised that there would be a removal, and that the land that the Cherokees lived on, the Cherokee Nation, part of that would go to Georgia. Well, after about 20 years, Georgia started to get a little bit itchy, and they said, when is this going to happen? So they created a militia and they began to confiscate lands. And the Cherokee Nation went to the United States and said, this is not right. It says right here in the United States Constitution that only the federal government would have the right to conduct commerce with foreign nations and American Indian tribes. It's right there in the Constitution, in the Commerce Clause. And at this point, we had already begun to elect leaders. Our ancestors lived in little bitty villages, little by modern standards, less than 1,000 people. Average size about 350, 400 people. And there were about 60 of those at the time of contact. Well, each individual village was autonomous. They made their own rules. They had to get along with other Cherokees, but each community had their own leaders, and they got to make their own decisions. One Cherokee town could be best friends and trading partners with the Creeks, and the next town over could have been at war with them. So it wasn't a nation by the way that we think of it today, because each community was almost like an independent city-state. Well, England didn't want to deal with that. And then later, the United States certainly didn't want to deal with that. You don't make a treaty with every town. So they said, we aren't going to do any more fur trade with you guys until you decide who's the boss. So one town would get very prosperous, and they would have a lot of trade arrangements, and they would be doing very well. And the leader of that town would declare themselves the emperor of all the Cherokees. And England would be like, okay, we agree. And they would go and sign a treaty with that guy. Well, the other towns would be like, wait, we don't even know who those people are. We don't even know if they're Cherokee. So that kind of whole divide and conquer thing was really getting to us. So we decided initially that the leaders of each of these various communities would meet together in a grand council and they would make decisions. And once they started doing that, basically they became a representational democracy. Eventually, by 1825, we had a constitution. And we began to elect our community leaders. And from those community leaders, we elected a principal chief, a chief above others. And ultimately, we patterned our government after the United States. And so did the other tribes around us. We weren't alone in this. Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and Seminoles, they called us 5 civilized tribes for that reason. Because our system was very similar to the federal government. So, we were a nation before the removal. But Georgia didn't like that. In the 20 years before they were promised our land and the removal, that was when we established our representational democracy. We had a constitution, we had laws, we had it all going on, and that's why they got so itchy. They said, if we don't act now and get our land, then we'll never have it. So they raised a militia and they began to confiscate houses and property, because a lot of the Cherokees at this point had become affluent. They had plantation-style homes, and they had slaves. They said that Rich Jovan was the richest man in the world, and he was a Cherokee. So we were a rich nation, and we had quality lands, and then they discovered gold. And you can imagine what happened at that point. That's when Georgia really got serious about it. And they said, well, we can't control the Indians. The federal government says that, but we can control the white people that go there. And these missionaries, they need to have what's that called? A license to preach in Cherokee Nation, and they have to come and pay Georgia for it. Well, Wooster, who was already there, said, that's not right. Cherokee Nation is its own sovereign. Why do I have to pay Georgia to go visit my friends in the Cherokee Nation? And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, Worcester versus Georgia. And the Supreme Court declared that Cherokee Nation was not a foreign nation. It was a domestically dependent nation, like a ward to the state, in a state of pupillage to the United States government. But only the United States government had authority over the Indian tribes. So that meant that Georgia's laws really didn't matter as long as the Cherokee Nation existed. But guess who was president? Jackson. You guys know the story. We didn't have eyewitness accounts, but the rumor says that he said something along the lines of, let Marshall enforce that. So he said, let the Supreme Court enforce that. I'm the executive, but I take my hands off. He basically gave carte blanche authority to the state of Georgia to do what they wanted, despite what the Supreme Court said. And things got rough. Things got rough in the Cherokee Nation. And the removal was the process. That's what happened. There was a treaty party. They were politicians that were not in elected positions at the time, but they had been community leaders. They were leaders, but they signed an illegal treaty with the United States government called the Treaty of New Echota in 1835. And the United States government recognized it. And with an act of Congress, passed the Removal Act by one vote. And in 1838, we were required to leave. The first couple of contingencies were on the water route, and they were led by the United States military. But it was so bad that the Cherokee Nation said, let us do it. Give us the money and we'll remove ourselves. So the other 14 contingents removed themselves. So sometimes you'll hear stories about how cruel the soldiers were on the Trail of Tears. Those probably didn't happen, because the Cherokees removed themselves at that point. And if there were soldiers on the trail, they were there to help protect the Cherokees as they marched westward. When we got to Indian Territory, there were Cherokees there. There were a group of Cherokees that had left the east well before removal, because not only did they see the white writing on the wall, they didn't like what was happening over there. They didn't want to have to go to banks or school or all these new institutions that were propping up in the old Cherokee Nation East that connotated civilization. They said, we want to hunt, we want to farm, we want to do our dances, we want to live in the woods. And so initially they took their ceremonial fires and they moved them into Kentucky and Tennessee. That wasn't far enough. And they moved them into Arkansas. At first, eastern Arkansas, then later western Arkansas, and then finally there was a treaty, and well, there were a couple of them. One 1815, one 1818. They moved the fires into Indian Territory. And so when the other Cherokees came on the removal, there were already about 3,000 Cherokees there waiting on them. They had already set up a government, Cherokee Nation West. So that meant that there were these two different groups of Cherokees that met there in Tarawah, capital of the Cherokee Nation. And then there was another group, that treaty party that signed that treaty. They came out ahead of time. So they hid among the old settlers, the ones that were there already, and made friends. They had about 5 years to make friends with the old folks and spin their stories. And so when the rest of the Cherokees came on the Trail of Tears, there was a fight. The people that signed the treaty, they were assassinated. But what's interesting is those people that signed the treaty were some of the first lawmakers that made it a capital crime to sign a treaty and give land away. They were some of the first leaders that said, if you sign a treaty with the United States government on representation of Cherokee Nation and lose land, you will forfeit your life. They were the ones that wrote those laws. So when they signed that treaty, it was said that they knew they were signing their own death warrant. But they believed that they were doing what was best, because they thought if they held out too long, the United States government wouldn't let us remove it. They would just wipe us out. How many of you guys know the names of all the tribes east of the Cherokees? Exactly. So they thought, well, we may die for this, but at least we'll get some land where there are already Cherokees living, where they're putting the other civilized tribes. They're putting all these Indians over here in this one spot. We've been there. It looks nice. It's decent. They have clean water. Let's go there. And they forced the treaty. They broke the law, and they knew they were going to be killed, and most of them went. There was a big civil war. And those same lines, those same family lines, erupted again in the American Civil War. The ones that had signed the treaty were some of the most affluent Cherokees. They were the ones that owned the most slaves. They were the ones that had the most property. And they had acculturated to the Southern way of living. And so they had big plantation-style homes, and they joined the Knights of the Golden Circle. They joined the various, what do they call them, fraternal orders. And a lot of them were into cotton, tobacco, gin. And so they had the same economic interests as the Southern states. And so when the Confederacy rolled in, they said, we'll sign up. In fact, everybody in the Cherokee Nation signed up. Even Chief John Ross, later he said he was under duress, signed a treaty with the South. Well, right after he signed that treaty, he ran off to Philadelphia and he repudiated it, but he had already signed it. So everybody came through, and they were all conscripted into the Confederate Army, but the full-bloods saw all these Indians on the other side of them. Now, I'd already talked a little bit about full-bloods. A lot of the most traditional people had come to Indian Territory before the removal. They brought the ceremonial fires, they brought the dances, the hunting culture, the farming culture, the gathering culture. They wanted to live like their ancestors. That's why they moved away. And they maintained that system even after the removal. And some of the old Cherokees came and joined in with them. And at this point, there was only a slight majority of full-bloods in the Cherokee Nation around the time of the Civil War. And those full-bloods, at first, didn't take very strongly to Christianity, but aside from Worcester, that helped fight that case in court, there was another very important, influential missionary named Evan Jones. And Evan Jones came across the Trail of Tears with the Cherokees. And his son, John Jones, was the most successful missionary in Indian Territory, in the Cherokee Nation. John Jones was raised up speaking Cherokee, going to Cherokee dances, Cherokee ball games. He lived and breathed. He was Cherokee. From the Cherokee perspective, He was Cherokee, but he was Baptist. And they started translating the Bible, basically the New Testament, as early as the 1830s into the Cherokee language. Sequoyah invented a writing system and made it where the majority of Cherokees were literate overnight. Well, you can learn in about 2 weeks. You learn to read and write Cherokee. It's a phonetic system that's put into syllabary characters. So it marries really nicely with the spoken language. So they started translating the New Testament into Cherokee, but they left the Old Testament alone. Because those traditional people, they had their own stories. They had their own traditions. They had their own ceremonies. But they were open to the idea of the gospel. And so there was a Cherokee Baptist organization formed. And the Baptists became the biggest movement among the full-bloods right before the Civil War. And the Baptists were what? They were Northern Baptists. They were abolitionists. And so they were anti-slavery. And so the full-blood element, mostly Baptist, a few ceremonial people, all of them anti-slavery, were conscripted into service with the Confederacy. And so when the war broke out, they would actually cross the line in the middle of the night. And so Cherokees would fight with the Cherokees. And all those old divisions that were there from the time of the Trail of Tears erupted again. So it became full blood versus mixed blood. Confederate versus Union. And that Civil War lasted, well, who was the last to surrender in the Civil War? Stan Wading, who was a Cherokee. So there are a couple of counties in Oklahoma that the Civil War is still not ended. These families, they still remember each other. They still don't like each other. But what happened during this time is there was a secret organization called the Kituah Society that formalized themselves. They created a system of bylaws. And they followed a similar system of the other fraternal orders, like the Knights of the Golden Circle or the Masonic Lodge, where they would meet in secret and they would swear secrecy. And they were abolitionists. Most of them were Baptists, and quite a few of them were ceremonial people that still did the old ceremonial dances at the ceremonial fires. What happened during the Civil War, they pledged allegiance to the society, and they were secret. And to divulge another member's identity was they forfeited their lives. It was in the Bibles. Well, after the Civil War, the Kituah Society survived. But at this point, it kind of became a political movement. They began to focus on the language, the culture, community values. Some of the people that were on the other side said that they were a little bit like the KKK because they were the community police and they really kind of beat up on anybody that didn't agree with them. But the people on the other side, which was my family, said that they were there for the values, they were there for the family, they were there for the culture. They were there to combat acculturation. They were there to make sure that the language and ceremonies survived. They were there to make sure that these values that their ancestors had were pushed forward. So it depends on whose side of the story you listen to. And there was a political movement led by these Kituahs, and it was called the National Party. And they began to elect higher blood quantum leaders and people that spoke the language. And so there was kind of a cultural revival going on. At the same time that they were getting the male and female seminary, which gave us the best higher education, I can't even say it. First higher education west of the Mississippi. The female seminary was patterned after Mount Holyoke. Those things burned down, but the female seminary was rebuilt in Tahlequah, and now it's right in the middle of the campus of Northeastern State University. They still have seminary hall. Where it was before is where the Heritage Center is now. You can still see the columns there from the old seminary, where it was burned down. But there were a lot of changes. Cherokees were progressive, and then they had another side that was very cultural, and they would keep marrying each other. So as one side tried to hang on to who they were and another side tried to progress, it meant that they were becoming modern like Americans, but in a very Cherokee way. And the result of that was a breakup of the Kituah Society. Some of the Kituahs said the land is important, but not as important as being progressive. The other Katuas said, you guys think that way because you're Baptists. We're ceremonial people. And our fires are everything, and the land is everything. And we're not going to break up our communal land base. Because prior to that, all Cherokees owned the land in common. They had a petition, a right to use the land, but the land itself was owned by the Cherokee people. They owned the improvements to the land, what they built and what they grew, but everything else was owned in common. And the United States government was very concerned about this. They said, you Cherokees have progressed nicely, but you don't have it right. You're not greedy enough. They said, in fact, in order for them to understand the value of property, in order for them to understand how to get ahead in the world, they needed to increase their understanding of greed. It's written down. And so they passed this law that said this land will be broken up into pieces and given to individual families, heads of household. Well, people said, we know you're trying to help. We know you want to improve the lives of these Indians. But people are going to steal that land. Once you break it up, people are going to take it from those families. They said, no, we'll make laws that say that they own that land, but they don't have the right to buy and sell it. It'll be held in trust. It'll be restricted. Those were the words they used. And the Indians said, some of them were doctors and lawyers and such, and they said, we're just as smart as anybody else. We should be able to decide if we want to buy and sell our land. And they said, all right, well, you mixed blood smarty pants, you can do that. But the full bloods, if you're half or more, you have no right to buy and sell your land for the first 25 years. So they broke up all the land and they gave it to the heads of household. Well, people were living close to each other. And everybody got 160 acres. Well, it couldn't be contiguous, right? You can't all live on 160 acres, so they had homestead plots, which were small pieces of land that they lived on. And then they had other plots of land that were variously all throughout the... So you could own the land around your house, but since you had neighbors close by, you couldn't own all 160 acres around your house. So 3 counties over, you would own another 200 acres of land. So they began passing laws. Of course, greed got involved. And they said, well, you know, these homestead lands, they should still be in restricted status. They should still be held in trust. But those other lands, that surplus land, they should take off the restrictions. That way they can sell it. They don't even go, they've never seen that land. They own land that they've never seen. It's, 4 hours away by horseback. How often are they going to go over there? Let them sell that land. That increases their sense of propriety, their idea of wealth. It seemed like a good idea. Let them sell that land, and that land also becomes taxable at that point. Well, they didn't tell the Indians. And so, or if they told them, they didn't tell them in the right language. And so that land was no longer in trust. It was no longer restricted. It became taxable. They didn't pay taxes. You just go in and pay taxes and you get free land. So within the first 20 years after Oklahoma statehood, 80% of the Cherokee Nation was no longer in Cherokee hands. The Katuah Society was mad. They broke up into several little pieces, but there was one group of Katuahs that were ceremonial, that were traditional, and they said, we're not having anything to do with Cherokee Nation. We're tired of it. They suck. We definitely don't want to have anything to do with the state of Oklahoma. In fact, we believe our treaties with the United States government are sacred. We have this Union flag that we got for fighting on the side of the Union. We're friends. We knew who George Washington was. We still have the pipe he gave us. We have all these important sacred items. We have our ceremonial fires. We're going to go off in the woods and leave us alone. That's what they did. And they did all right. And we still have our ceremonial grounds. We still have our dances. But there were other groups of Katuahs that didn't do as well. Some of them were Baptists, some of them were Four Mothers or other ceremonial societies. And they were in the hills, and they were not allowed to participate in the politics of Oklahoma. The mixed blood, affluent Cherokees, they became important people. They became powerful people in their local municipalities. But the full bloods, the people that were culturally Cherokee, that spoke the language, that lived it, they really suffered, especially during the Great Depression. Now, this is on the east side of Oklahoma. This was happening different ways, different scenarios, but very similar patterns. among the 5 civilized tribes: Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. The east side of the state, those lands were broken into allotments and given to their tribal citizens, and they became Oklahoma citizens. Western part of the state, they had reservation land. It was a different trick. All those eastern Indians, they didn't grow up in the eastern part of Oklahoma. They were east of the Mississippi. So their land was exchanged for private property. So those tribes that lived in eastern Oklahoma, they didn't have reservations. Their land was the highest real estate value that you can have in the United States, private property. That's why the federal government can just take it from them. That's why they had to pass all these acts. That's why they had to get them to vote for it. But west of I-35, it was different. And they didn't have constitutions. They didn't have court systems. I mean, I've got an adopted brother that's Kiowa, and his grandma was fighting in Indian wars against people from Texas. Probably people I'm related to. And so they had a completely different situation going on in western Oklahoma. And it was ugly. Things were bad. They had this thing called the Miriam Report. They wanted to see how allotment was doing for Indians. They said, well, the eastern side of the state's doing all right, but in the west, we're not doing so good. It was the FDR time, John Collier era. They said we need to have the Indian Reorganization Act. And at first it didn't apply to Oklahoma tribes, but then they had the Oklahoma Indian Reorganization Act, or the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act. And it allowed for the western tribes to participate in this greater movement of tribal self-determination, because people were feeling kind of bad about it. And so the tribes in western Oklahoma were able to do like tribes across the United States and vote in a tribal council, which was really a business council. And the chair of that business council became their chairman, their chief. So it was like a cookie cutter constitution for all these reservation tribes. And the eastern side of the state wasn't allowed to do that because we were civilized tribes. We already had our own governments, and they had worked really hard to dismantle those governments. And they weren't going to give us that sort of thing. But there was a group of Cherokees that said, we qualify. Those Katuas banded together. The ceremonial people didn't really participate, but the other ones, the Baptists and the other groups that broke apart, came back together and became the United Katuas Incorporated and sought articles of incorporation under the state of Oklahoma. They became a nonprofit. And then when the Indian Reorganization Act came about, they petitioned Congress for federal recognition. And the federal government said, yes, you are a tribe. So the United Katuas became the United Katuah Band of Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma, a federally recognized tribe under an act of Congress. Now, they're not exactly the same. Most of the families that got together to rebuild this Katuah society and become incorporated, they were descendants of the old settlers. They were descendants of that first group of Cherokees that came over. And so the first people that organized it said, we're separate from these other Cherokees that came later. We're the old Western Cherokees. And some of them were. But in '51, when they became federally recognized, they had a roll, and everybody wrote down their names and stuff. And a lot of them were parts of the same extended families, descendants of those Western Cherokees. But they said, if you're on our movement and you're more than half, you're half or more, you can be a Katuah. So they had a blood quantum. You had to be half of them. That changed in the 70s. It's down to a quarter now. But at this point, any Cherokee Nation citizen that's a quarter or more, regardless of who your ancestors are, can go and join the United Katuah Band. So they're the other federally recognized tribe. So we have the United Katuah Band. We have other groups of Katuahs that aren't related to that political group that are ceremonial Cherokees, and they're organized as churches. And they do the ceremonial dance. They still have their dances and ceremonies. And some of them are enrolled Katuah, and some of them are enrolled Cherokee Nation. And then we have Cherokee Nation citizens. And as long as one of your ancestors signed the Dawes allotment roll at the time of Oklahoma statehood, and you have a paper trail to that person, you're a citizen. It doesn't matter what your card fraction says. As long as you're tied through paper to somebody that was there, you're in the allotment period. You're a citizen. So there's no blood quantum limit. So we have over 340,000 Cherokee citizens. More than half of those are outside of our tribal jurisdiction area. It was never a reservation. So we can't say the Cherokee Nation reservation because it was fee simple property. But we still have those 14 counties, and we can still draw a line where the ancestors have got that land, and we call that our tribal jurisdictional area. And more than half of our population lives outside. Now, a lot of them are in Tulsa, nearby. A lot of them are in Fort Smith. A lot of them are in Siloam Springs. A lot of them are in Oklahoma City. So most of our population is still right here. But some of them are flung out as far as California and Florida. So to be a citizen means you have voting rights. It means that you have an opportunity to apply for scholarships and for loans that you may not have. But most of those things are also salary dependent. There's a word. It escapes me. Income dependent. So you have to meet the income guidelines. So just because you're a Cherokee citizen, it doesn't mean you're entitled to any of those services. In fact, you have to live within the 14 county jurisdictional area for most of them. You get to vote no matter where you live. But anywhere there's an Indian clinic, you also can use it for free. Which the Indian clinics are a lot like those free clinics that you find in the cities anyways. So if you have insurance, it's not good to go to the Indian hospital. It's getting better. It's getting better. Over the last 20 years, I would say that our Hastings Indian Hospital in Tahlequah can probably compete with any other small community hospital. So it's getting a lot better. Because now, if you have insurance, then the Indian clinic can also charge your insurance. So people that work at the tribe, we try to go to the Indian clinics because we have insurance through the tribe, through our employers. So we go in there and we get seen at no cost to us. We don't have to pay the copay because the tribe picks that up. And the insurance company pays for our medical treatment. So it's kind of a win-win situation. Western Oklahoma, they're smaller tribes. Like I pointed out before, we have about 39 tribes in Oklahoma. In the West, they're small. And they face economic challenges. Their great-grandparents still lived in the same lifestyle that their ancestors did. So they're still kind of reeling from some of those changes. So there are some big differences between some of the western tribes and the eastern tribes. On the eastern side of Oklahoma, Choctaws, Cherokees, Creeks, Seminoles, Chickasaws, we have really a lot in common. Economically, we're doing well. We make wise investments. Everybody likes to talk about our casinos, and I'm not going to lie, they help. But there's a diversified portfolio. They do a lot of business with the American government, and also with private corporations. Things like Macy's. People put their warehouses there. Since some of that land was never taken out of restricted status, it was never taken away from trust status, some of that land never was sold from the original inhabitants, it doesn't have the same state restrictions that regular Oklahoma law does. It has federal restrictions, but different state restrictions. So that means that the federal government and other companies can set up business on those lands. An example being casinos or even smoke shops, where the state laws are different because that land is still held by the federal government in restricted status. So they did an oops there. So we have little pockets of reservation land basically. And those things allow our tribe to use the protections afforded from the federal government for purposes of commerce. So we have to make compacts with the state. We have to form agreements so they don't fight with us. But ultimately, because we have this land that's separate from the state laws, it means that we can kind of push the state to allow for things like gaming, tobacco, and even certain sort of businesses that are there. I'm not talking legal businesses, but where does the federal government need to store information, right? So if they have, all these files and files downloaded on their cloud, right? For the CIA, FBI, if they put it in a state, there are complications. But if they put it on federal land, that's not technically a part of a state. So you can see where some of this land might be helpful, right? And so it's not just casinos for us. One of the things that we found most challenging is environmental issues, because we were so focused on providing services to our tribal members, our citizens, that we weren't thinking like a government at first. We were thinking like a large nonprofit, and that's how we acted for a long time. That's important. You want your people to have homes, because they didn't. You want your people to have electricity and running water, because they didn't. So they've been focused on trying to bring up their quality of life, their health care, provide jobs in the communities. And suddenly they realized, according to our treaties, we still have these waters. We still have these rivers. Not only do we have a right to them, we have a responsibility to protect them. And the EPA is not always on the side of the people, right? Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. Sometimes they're on the side of the corporations. So our tribes now are waking up. And they're saying, oh, that Illinois River, chicken poop is not good for you. What can we do about that? Why are our kids getting sick when they swim? So we now have a Secretary of Natural Resources. And it's her job to start to figure out some of these things. So environmental issues are becoming a bigger issue, land management. Before we had all this land, and so the tribe would just let farmers lease it, which was fine, but sometimes they let ranchers lease it. And they would just come and they would tear off all the trees and put cows out there. And that's good money, but it's bad for your rivers. Bad for your rivers. So they're starting to rethink some of those things. And not all those things are popular, because that's money. So we're caught in this catch-22. Do we rake in this money from our land leases, or do we try to protect our environment? We're learning some things. Out west, they don't have the same holdings. Our ancestors talk about where we came from. They say at one time all Indians were from one place. You go Higatagasa, we came from an island of giant turtles. Now this could all just be stories. But our elders say, not all of them even agreed, that there was an island a long time ago and there were these turtles, and we took care of them and they took care of us. Well, we failed to take care of them and we lost the island. That was the first world. And we went to the second world, which was between the waters. And the way they describe this world, we're pretty sure that it's somewhere in Central America. Maybe we were married up with Mayans and Aztecs, I'm not sure. Other people say, no, it was up around the Great Lakes, between the waters, right? Either way, it was between the waters. And there's some crazy, fabulous stories about morality and how to treat one another that came from the struggles when we lived in that second world. Our value systems like Deita Geyu Sayasti, which they translate that as love one another, but what it means is be stingy with each other. Well, there's love and stinginess, right? But it's not, I'm stingy. I'm stingy with someone means that I don't want them used up. I don't want them mistreated. I don't want to ask too much of them, and I don't want to see them hurt themselves. So it's a stinginess on someone else's behalf, which is kind of love, right? Another one is Deita da love or Deisting. It translates as like each other, but that's pretty weak. It's a pretty weak translation. What it means is hold everybody in a very high regard and have a positive affection. It means no matter how rotten somebody is, if you get to know them, you'll find value in them. You have to find that value, and you have to look up to them for that. There's another teaching that says, Deita da liya, say estin. And you got to put a liya in it. If you just say it flat, Deita da liya, say estin, it means go out yonder and fight, wrestle around. But if you put a pop in the middle, Deita da liya, say estin, it means struggle to hold on to each other. So you still see people grappling in your head, however you say the word. Because it's a very descriptive language. So struggle to hold on to somebody, because if you really care about them, you shouldn't let words get in the way. You shouldn't let anything come between you and that person you care about. Now this has to be a two-way relationship. If you're struggling to hold on to somebody that doesn't want to be held on to, that's stalking. And another teaching is Uskedi Deita da yela sayesting. Uskedi is a separate word. It means heavy. But we have two different types of adjectives in Cherokee. One group that describes qualities that shouldn't be measured. And another group that describes qualities that are measured, quantities. So we have one set of words that are for qualities and one set of words that are for quantities. So if I want to measure something, I see galgeda, how heavy it is. But usked is heavy too, but it's in a way that you shouldn't measure. It's a value. So usked is unique, of heavy gravity or importance. The second word is Deitsadal says thing. When they put them together, they say it means treat each other sacred. That's kind of weak. That's a weak translation. That heaviness is a unique value. And that Deitsadal says thing is liken yourself to one another's image. So that means find what is most unique and valuable in one another and learn from it and be more like it. So it means a whole lot more than treat each other sacred. So these are some of these values that we learned from our stories in the second world. The third world was our homeland in the east, the Smoky Mountains, Chilaku Weating. And that was where we really came into our own as Cherokees, or as Katuas. Now if you ask most Cherokees, how do you say Cherokee in Cherokee? They say Chalagi. That's true. G Chalagi, I'm Cherokee. He Chalagi, you're Cherokee. Ah Chalagi, he's Cherokee. Ani Chalagi, they're Cherokee. How you change the beginning of the word changes who you're talking about, but Chalagi is the root. It's the basics. When I ask elders what it means, they say, I don't know. I think it came from Choctaws, what they told me. So we took another tribe's word and we gave it to ourselves. And I said, well, what did we call ourselves? They said, sometimes we call ourselves Jiyawiya. So, well, what does that mean? I said, oh, that means Indian. So, is there a specific word for just Cherokees that we used to use? They said, Anigadu Wagin. Anigadu Wagin. That's where the word Katua came from. From the Katua Society, the United Katua Band, all those Katuas I was talking about in the Civil War, that word isn't used by all Cherokees anymore. But our elders say that that's our original word for ourselves. Anigadu Wagin. And so people that are the most traditional minded, people that are the most politically conservative from a Cherokee spectrum, they use that word almost as a patriotic flag. Anigadu Wagin. The root of that is Gadu. And Gadu means on top. Gadu is bread. Gadu is on top, so you have to sing it right. Gadu would be on top of the table. Gadusi, where our word for Katusa comes from, means on top of the hill. So Anigadu Wagi are the people that are supposed to rise above, climb to the top, and not get dragged down. So it's a value system. It teaches us to behave a certain way, to not sweat the small stuff. So this word to do is a very valuable word for us. It's a rallying cry to put up or shut up, to act right or go home. It's that value system. All over western Oklahoma, they're just now getting organized to focus on their environment. In eastern Oklahoma, we're starting to change our perspective from how can we make money off of our lands to how can we make our lives better by using our lands. And